Great. Thank you so much. It's so good to see so many old friends here. I've had a chance to visit with many of you already individually, and look forward to visiting with others of you as the week goes by. And for the new faces, or at least new to me in the room, it's also delightful to see this circle expanding. And what a pleasure it is to hear about all your different projects. I try to keep an eye on these different projects, but there's nothing like hearing them presented by their creators and by the people who have operational responsibility to get a sense of how the open educational resources community is coming together. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hal Plotkin. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of Education in the U.S. Department of Education. Our office has responsibility for all U.S. federal higher education programs and policies. And I'm also, and part of the reason that I'm there, a long-time member of this OER community, having participated in many of these conferences at David's invitation in previous years, and having had the great pleasure of watching this global social phenomena grow and develop. Before I begin, let me start my talk the way I always do, but there's something on OER the way I always do, but there's something special about my ability to do so on this occasion, which is to thank the two people who are most responsible for the fact that any of us are here, or that any of this progress and promise is becoming possible, and that's our colleagues Mike Smith and Kathy Casterly. And we can give them a round of applause. It's well deserved. But let me just say, I'm a believer in what the biologist Donald Fried said years ago about the biology of human learning, that the need to learn and the need to become educated and to educate oneself is built into our DNA. It's part of our survival mechanism. It's part of who we are as human organisms. So in some sense, this entire open educational resource movement is, I always felt from the moment I was first fascinated with it, as inevitable, as just an inevitable part of how we as a human family will grow and develop. Because as new tools and technologies, the internet, the microprocessor, gave us new capacities, a lot of the light bulbs went off in a lot of our heads at the same time about how that changed what was possible. And as it changed what was possible, it brought that new set of possibilities within reach, and as a human family, we began reaching for it. But what Mike and Kathy did, through their vision and their courage and just their good fortune of being in positions where they could assist it, is they rapidly accelerated the development of this phenomena that was biologically inevitable for our species anyway by decades, by laying for us a smart and effective foundation through the support of many of our projects, going back 8 or 10 years now, that rather than trying to create some finished phenomena, they very, very smartly analyzed the sort of state of play at the time and thought 30 years ahead, but then also thought, what do we need to do to create the foundation that will allow the processes to develop, that will create what we all know is possible 30 years from now, but instead of it happening 30 years from now as some kind of a biological, natural evolutionary process, how can we accelerate it so it happens in 10 years, not 30? And we are presented here at this conference with the opportunity to build on the foundation that they created and to similarly accelerate beyond the normal trajectory that these events would take place in the due course of time, but through a similar process of acceleration. So that's what I want to talk about. Let me also thank David Wiley for his groundbreaking work and leadership and his invitation to this conference today, and for all of the work that he's done in bringing us together in previous years. David had asked me, I wasn't sure I could be here up until just a few days ago, and David had asked me for a title for this talk, and so thinking very quickly, I gave him a title, which was President Obama's 2020 Graduation Goal and the Role of Open Educational Resources. So let me dispense with that very quickly and then move on to what my spirit tells me is the most important message that I can bring to the conference today based on what I've understood about the sort of zeitgeist of where we're at and what's going on in the halls and the conversations I've had in the hallway. But many of you know President Obama set upon his inauguration as president, a very ambitious goal for the United States, that by 2020 we would have, once again, the most highly educated, best prepared, most competitive workforce in the world. If you do the math and you look at the different international benchmarks on which he and the policymakers who developed that goal have based that objective, you see that that means that the United States will have to produce about 8 million more post-secondary degree and credential holders by 2020 than it normally would as a normal function of growth and demographics. 8 million additional post-secondary degree holders. There's simply no way that we can do that and accomplish the President's clearly stated goal without using and relying on open educational resources. As our Assistant Secretary of Post-Secondary Education, Eduardo Ochoa, likes to say, we cannot accomplish the President's goal simply by encouraging the higher education institutions to do more of what they're currently doing in the same way that they're currently doing it. The math doesn't work. There aren't enough seats, even if you had the complete throughput of the system and every student that could graduate got a seat, and every student who was in that seat graduated, you still wouldn't get to the number, and that kind of performance is impossible to imagine at any rate. So open educational resources has to be a fundamental part of accomplishing the President's graduation goal. Now that I've dispensed with the part of the talk that I anticipated, let me get on to the part that I didn't anticipate, but which I think is more important for our discussions today and for our thinking forward about this. And that is about the issue of sustainability and the role of government policy and the proper way to architect a path to sustainability that works in the context of educational enterprises that are all around the globe supported by government entities of one type or another. And let me begin by just telling you an anecdote that will then help, from which I extrapolate the appropriate public policy directions here. As some of you know, before joining the Obama administration, I worked as a governance official, a member of the Board of Trustees with an interest in open educational resources at the Foothill De Anza Community College District, where one of our very first big projects, again, was in the area that Kathy mentioned, statistics, where we had a professor who was interested, who had authored a textbook in statistics that the publisher had abandoned, and who was interested in making that material OER and making it available to her students. And, you know, we had contending thought in the statistics department, even at that college, and not to mention throughout the system. Others were interested in using their own materials. Another professor at the same school was teaching a statistics course that he taught for many, many years, where he was using not quite a textbook, but a set of learning materials that he had published himself and was selling to the students through the college bookstore. So we had two models. And our administration, our governance officials in our community college, decided that what we were going to do is we were going to support faculty members in developing the pedagogical approaches that they thought were most appropriate. And so that meant supporting the faculty member who had his own proprietary textbook, and it also meant offering at least equal support to the faculty member who wanted to embark on a new approach. Well, as her open educational resources textbook was made available, and as it became known that students could take that class and get their learning materials initially for free, that was they'd go to the college bookstore, and it was one of the things that I always saw as a governance official at registration day at the college, one of the most heartbreaking sights, and if you know what to look for, you can see it all across our country, are the students who walk through the college bookstores with their course catalog in hand, particularly in our community colleges, trying to calculate how many courses they can afford to take and how many books are required for this one and that's the meter for many of our students that determines how fast they can move through the system. So as the OER statistics course became more and more popular, the other professor was losing students. and was facing the situation where the sections that he anticipated teaching were not available because the students were voting with their feet for an approach that served their needs better. We were also learning, just anecdotally at first, but I think we have evidence for this now, that the students who were using the OER textbook were doing better in subsequent classes. And one of the reasons for that, again, it just seems obvious and intuitive, is that the students could keep their textbooks and maintain access to it. It has always struck me as a crime, literally a crime, that all across the United States we have colleges that put up big banners that encourage students 4 times a year to sell their books back to the school. Educational institutions that are telling students they don't need books. When have you ever walked into an educated person's home and asked them, where are your books? It's always sold them all back to the bookstore. But that's what we tell. That's what our institutions tell particularly poor students in the United States. You can get ahead in this world, you can be an educated person, and you can do it without books. So it was just nonsense. Well, over time, the faculty member that had his own proprietary textbook, after about a year and a half, a light went off in his head. And he made his proprietary textbook open. And now students have choices of 2 different open textbooks and open sections. And this was done not through coercion or mandate or requirements, but simply by supporting the development of what you might call an alternate OER universe, whose very merits, by virtue of the way that universe constructs itself, is organized, and operates, is so advantageous to the community that we are trying to serve that, again, in the natural biology of things, it overtakes the less useful organism that's part of our enterprise. So the big pitch that I would make on public policy is twofold. One is that, and it has to do with what Raquel was saying in her keynote this morning, when she was talking about paying attention to the laws and interacting with the legal system, the copyright system, the purchasing practices of public institutions and all of these kinds of things, that from my perspective, what I've discovered is most effective is to look for the adopters of OER and to impel or encourage our governmental entities and our governance structures in higher education simply to support the faculty members who want to engage in open scholarship and in the OER community, without wasting any time, effort, psychic energy, financial resources, or anything else in trying to convince those who are not convinced that they ought to do something differently from the way they're doing. We have enough opportunity on our hands and enough interesting, that's a Freudian slip there, they're interested and they're usually interesting too, scholars and faculty members around the world who, because of the very same reasons they became scholars and faculty members in the first place, want to participate in this alternate academic universe that many of you are architects of, that we can spend all of our time fruitfully engaging them and supporting them and looking for appropriate policy vehicles and governance vehicles to support them without engendering the opposition of any other forces who don't want to be compelled or required or so we don't have to change, in my view, we don't really have to change anything except our own approach to how we engage our academic and governance colleagues. And the best way to do that is through supporting those who are interested and inclined to participate in this movement and then providing them with the information and resources they need to be effective participants. At the same time, when we talk with government leaders, we need to follow what I think is a very, very simple mantra, and that is public expenditures should create public resources. And this is just a frame of thinking that is intuitively understood by most policymakers in every realm outside of academia. And I've had this discussion now with many members of our own administration and with many leaders around the country. And I use a very simple analogy, which is when the Department of Interior in the United States agrees that the time has come to create a new public park, and they need to hire some contractors to build the roads for the park and the little trails and the paths and the little benches and the walkways and all the rest. How much sense would it make to tell the contractor that received that money to construct the park that at the end of their construction process they own the park? Right? It would make no sense at all. But in academia and in publishing and in public expenditures related to education, the typical model has been that whoever gets the contract to develop or to operate the facility then owns whatever it is that the public has paid for them to develop and operate. So that leads me back full circle to where I started, which is the Obama administration and the 2020 goal. We have adopted and enshrined in the public documents that we have shared with others, including in our new technology plan, which has already been pre-published on the web for comment, but which will be published in final form shortly, a commitment that public resources used through public educational expenditures should yield public resources. And we have specifically, for the first time in the history of an American administration, enumerated our support for open educational resources and using in that very clear language. This is based on the specific commitment that President Obama made himself personally in March of last year when he spoke in Warren, Michigan, and outlined his proposal to create what he called at the time the Online Skills Initiative. He envisioned a set of courses that would be freely available to all members of the American public, but by extension to all citizens of the world, that would help lead to the accomplishment of the 2020 graduation goal that he set. And what more I can tell you about that is that although I'm not in a position to make an announcement today, but I can tell you that the President's goal with respect to open education resources remains our guiding North Star, and that we anticipate before too long making a public announcement of what will amount to the most substantial governmental investment in the creation of open educational resources in the history of our movement. Resources that we hope will, again, acting on the foundation that Kathy and Mike created, put us in a position to accelerate the progress, we hope, by decades that would otherwise come naturally to the human family as we all look for ways to grow and develop. Let me conclude then by suggesting what I think some of the most important things that you can do are, at least from my perspective, in the policy-making realm. I know all of you are involved in some of you involved in policy, some of you involved in content, programmatic, tools, all the rest. But I'm hoping all of you, even for those of you who don't have much to do with policymakers, will be willing to take on one additional responsibility. And before I describe that responsibility, let me explain why it was so important. Some of you were with us at the OCW meeting in Hanoi a few months ago. And I was struck at that meeting by the number of people who got up and talked about the need that we have in one permutation or another, the need that we have to create some kind of a sustainability model. You know, that we need an organization that will maybe be paying dues, somebody said. And then there'd be an infrastructure because, you know, we just can't depend forever on the Hewlett Foundation or on others to continually sprinkle money on the field. We need some kind of to think through some kind of what would be the thing that would have a lot of people participating in it, and they'd be paying some money. And we heard that this morning, too, about the different sustainability models. And what I would put to you is we do have already such an organization that exists in all of our countries to the degree that at least I know about it. And it's called the government. It's an organization that we all pay dues to, that we all belong to, and that is supposed to promote and advance our common welfare. And for some reason, having to do with the sociology of government and all the rest that would be too much to talk about today, over time, the understanding of government's responsibilities with regard to intellectual property has been such that the government is the primary guardian of the privatization of intellectual property for the benefit of the creator of the intellectual property. But as was pointed out to us in our keynote addresses this morning, that if the origins of government involvement in intellectual property markets are to protect the common welfare, then without attacking the edifice of copyright that already exists, we have an opportunity to expand government's understanding of what its opportunities are here to promote our common welfare. That's what we're trying to do in the Obama administration, and that's what I think the opportunity is for us in working with government entities all across the world, and in particular in the United States, where we need a lot of education about that opportunity. If it serves the public interest to allow an intellectual property maker to protect their profits for a creation unto the third generation, then we can easily make the same argument that we've heard made earlier this morning about a co-equal responsibility of government, not to prevent those people from exercising their rights as they currently enjoy them, but simply to support those of us who would like to be participants in a different structure, in a collegial structure where we share information, we share resources, and we continually collaborate to develop them. And that's the opportunity that government has. That's the reason that with Kathy's notable help, I was finally able to publish something I've been working on for quite some time, a guide for public policy and higher education governance officials related to open educational resources called Free to Learn. And you can find it. It's available on a CC BY license at the Creative Commons website. Just search for Creative Commons Free to Learn. And the appeal that I would make to you is target somebody in your local community, wherever you are, who's either a governance official at an academic institution or, even better, an elected official, and bring them along. You can use the guide that's out there now on the Creative Commons website. You may use other materials that may be more useful. But take it on yourselves to educate the policymakers about the opportunity that they have to better serve their citizens at lower cost with greater efficacy through the use of open educational resources. I can't tell you from all the times that I've now visited the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Senate, state legislatures around the country, that the knowledge about open educational resources and its utility in terms of a viable public policy is understood by perhaps 1% of the decision makers whose involvement could move what we're doing from the periphery of education to its core, where its impact would be truly transformative. So that's my appeal to you today, is to not only continue the excellent and collaborations that are being so fruitful, whose magnificent products are on display here, but to spread the circle and to include those who are not presently involved, in particular the leaders of our public government, public education institutions, to acquaint them with not only what is their opportunity, but their responsibility to support the evolution of this movement so that we can continue the acceleration that Mike and Kathy made possible in getting us all started. Thank you so much for your attention.
I very much like your passionate plea for the government's role for sustainability, and I think you're completely right. It's a matter of reallocation of budget, and that's very easy to do. And I would like to challenge you to bring together the governments of the US, for Education and of the Netherlands, where I'm working in, because in the Netherlands something interesting is going on. The government is taking responsibility for OER, but not at the level that you are asking for. And so I would very much like to have contact between those two governments. I'm in a position to arrange that in our country, and I think this is a very important statement that you made. It's a powerful statement, and I'm not sure whether this is also applicable to developing countries, but I'm sure that for the rich countries you you made, I think, a very important contribution to this conference.
Thank you very much. What I can tell you is that the Secretary of Education, the Undersecretary, with the encouragement of the former counselor to the Secretary of Education, has been sending me all over the world, including to deal with organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to try and get this appeal on their roadmap. So as they begin to contemplate what the agendas will be for future intergovernmental conferences, that this opportunity for cross-border collaborations is highlighted in those forums. But I welcome your invitation.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what might be a challenge, a political or legal challenge, from the multi-billion-dollar textbook industry to government involvement in open education resources.
Well, you know, there's certainly they have their interests and they have their mechanisms for expressing their interests, which are well reflected in our legal codes and in our laws. But we also see promising indications in the publishing community of startup businesses, like Flat World Knowledge, for example, that are seeing the development of these new resources as creating additional economic opportunities that can grow publishing businesses quite substantially. I can tell you that as a government official, I've been amused to have visits from publishers, lobbyists, who will come in and tell us this is the worst idea possible. We're going to cut you off at the knees. We really would like to stop this. You know, we just think that what you're doing is un-American and absolutely horrible, and we will defeat you in Congress. And then I get a visit from another representative of the very same publisher, who's in their research and development department or their vice president of future planning, who comes in to tell us that he thinks what we're doing is absolutely brilliant, and the wave of the future, and talks about how their company is planning to re-architect what they're doing to accelerate progress. And I say to these people, you work for the same company. Do you know each other? have you met each other? So it's in flux, but I wouldn't be intimidated by that in any respect. I think, again, a part of this is inevitable, and I'm now old enough and having been involved in politics long enough that I have seen bigger, more substantial, richer, and more ruthless foes oppose necessary public interventions who have come a cropper for it. And I just don't think that there are certain historical forces that overwhelm even the most well-oiled lobbying machines, and I think that those of you in this room represent a sort of inexorable force of progress that won't be deterred. We will be annoyed by some of the more unfortunate obstacles that get placed in our path, but I think I've never seen any of them yet that look more that don't look more like hurdles than walls, and I wouldn't let that be a concern.